The winter of 1943 was cruel across Europe. In the smoking ruins of the North African front, tens of thousands of weary German soldiers, many from Erwin Rommel's famed Afrika Korps, lowered their rifles and surrendered to the Allies. They had endured months of hunger, heat, and relentless pressure, only to find themselves marched toward a future none of them could imagine. Most believed captivity would mean humiliation or even starvation. German officers warned them that Americans and British would treat them like animals. Propaganda whispered the same message. The enemy will not spare you. So as they boarded crowded transports, their thoughts were grim. Some prayed, others cursed. Most embraced the quiet certainty that the worst was still ahead. They were wrong. The journey was long. German prisoners disembarked from troop ships onto American soil beginning in mid-1943, stepping into a world so far removed from the battlefields that many felt as if they'd been dropped onto another planet. Some arrived through New York, seeing the distant skyline as their first glimpse of the country they'd been told was weak, decadent, and on the brink of collapse. Instead, they found bustling dockyards, endless machinery, and workers who barely seemed aware that a world war was raging. From there, trains ferried them deep inland to Texas, Oklahoma, Nebraska, Arkansas, Kansas. At every window they passed, they saw farmland stretching beyond the horizon, prosperity unimaginable to a Europe under siege. Storehouses overflowed even as rationing continued. Tractors plowed fields so wide that entire villages could fit within them. One prisoner later wrote, "We traveled for days. We thought we had reached the countryside, but it never ended." This was only one small part of America to men who had lived on ersatz coffee and hard black bread. The scale of American abundance was the first shock. In the camps, another awaited. When German POWs lined up for their first meals, they expected what they had known in Europe: watery soup, moldy bread, maybe thin meat on good days. The Wehrmacht fed its troops reasonably well early in the war. But by 1943, supplies were dwindling, and many prisoners had survived on rations not much better than civilians back home. Some had grown gaunt, their cheeks had sharpened. So when steaming trays appeared, many stared in disbelief. Fresh vegetables, tender beef, real butter, desserts. A few thought it was a trick, a single generous meal followed by misery. Others wondered whether American guards were mocking them. But the abundance continued. It was not generosity born of kindness, but rather of principle. The United States, unlike Germany or Japan, adhered strictly to the Geneva Convention. Prisoners of war were to be fed according to the same standards as the American Army itself. Camp commanders took that literally. In some places, German prisoners of war ate better than the American guards who served them. Cafeterias cooked giant cauldrons of stew and roasts. Meat and vegetables arrived from the same suppliers feeding U.S. soldiers. Flour, sugar, potatoes, canned goods, enough to keep every man energized and healthy. And so it began. The first rumors whispered among the prisoners. "This is better than home. My wife has never served such food. Are we really their enemies?" The greatest surprise was dessert: chocolate cake, fruit pies, ice cream. At Camp Swift in Texas, German prisoners watched in wonder as American cooks unpacked crates of creamy ice. In winter, they licked cold spoons with childlike glee. Some didn't believe it was real. They had not seen ice cream in years. The taste brought tears to their eyes, a reminder of childhood perhaps, or of a Germany before hunger became normal. Among the most astonishing experiences came during harvest season. When prisoners were assigned to work on farms, they were paid wages by the U.S. government, a small sum, but real money, exchangeable for goods at camp canteens. They returned to barracks with arms full of cigarettes, soap, and candy. Guards sometimes joked that their POWs were better stocked than American GYS shipping out to Europe. The humiliation was subtle, but undeniable. These were the soldiers of Hitler's mighty army, fed at the pleasure of an enemy they were told was inferior. At first, some refused the meals. They claimed military pride demanded they suffer. That hunger was noble, that comfort was betrayal. But hunger is a persuasive negotiator. Within days, most surrendered. Not to the enemy army, but to the irresistible lure of full plates. And gradually, a strange transformation began. German prisoners gained weight. Their cheeks filled again. Letters home described captivity not as torment, but as a world where food was plentiful and life predictable. Parents read with disbelief. Wives wept. Sons and daughters, half starving, wondered how the enemy could feed their fathers better than Germany could. Only months earlier, these men had faced death in the desert. Now they ate steak on Sundays. Some began to wonder whether the war and everything they'd been told had been a lie. In the strange quiet of American captivity, their worldview began to crack. Inside America's sprawling POW camps, the daily rhythm of captivity settled quickly, though it was unlike anything German soldiers had imagined. Many had pictured cold wooden barracks, interrogations, and punishment. Instead, they found orderly compounds. Long huts, mess halls, recreational fields, classrooms, even theaters. Barbed wire defined the perimeter. But inside that boundary, life was strangely humane. At dawn, the prisoners rose to the sound of whistles. Morning roll call came brisk and efficient. Afterward, they marched to breakfast, often eggs, bacon, oatmeal, and warm bread. For veterans of the North African campaign, who had eaten tinned meat and stale crusts for months, this daily routine felt surreal. One recalled watching an American cook pour out milk as if it were nothing. To a German soldier, milk during wartime was a luxury, and pouring it down a drain bordered on sinful. Meals followed the same pattern. Hearty, generous, and consistent. Camp records showed that thousands of prisoners gained weight during their captivity, some by tens of pounds. So dramatic was the contrast that U.S. officials occasionally worried the public might resent how well the enemy was being fed. And yet the rules were clear. The Geneva Convention demanded equitable treatment. Out in the camp yards, prisoners gathered under the sun. Some played soccer on dusty fields, shouting instructions in their native tongue. Others lounged in the shade, trading cigarettes and stories. A few walked endless circles around the compounds, lost in thought about loved ones, glancing at the distant world beyond the wire. Work assignments were voluntary, but most men accepted them. The war had stripped them of purpose. Labor restored it. The U.S. Army employed them in sawmills, canning plants, farms, and construction. These tasks filled their days, gave modest wages, and eased the agricultural labor shortage caused by American men fighting overseas. Over 400,000 prisoners of war contributed to the home front. A quiet irony of history. German soldiers soon discovered that working meant more than survival. It meant freedom of movement. It meant interaction with American civilians. And sometimes, it meant being treated like ordinary workers rather than captured enemies. On remote farms in the Midwest, prisoners were picked up by civilian trucks and driven to fields stretching to the horizon. Farmers often greeted them warmly, offering sandwiches and coffee during breaks. A few housewives brought pies or fresh fruit, placing them on long wooden tables. In their diaries, German POWs described these moments with disbelief. They expected hatred. Instead, they were given kindness. Such encounters sowed doubt about Nazi propaganda. How could a supposedly ruthless, degenerate enemy treat them with such humanity? The cultural dissonance deepened inside the camps. The U.S. allowed and even encouraged education. Prisoners could enroll in classes taught by fellow POWs or visiting professors. Topics ranged from mathematics to literature. The most popular were English lessons, driven not by interest, but by hope, the belief that language might help them navigate a future beyond defeat. Books flowed freely. Libraries within the camps carried everything from German classics to American novels. Some read Goethe and Schiller. Others dove into Mark Twain or Ernest Hemingway, exploring worlds they had never known. One POW later reflected, "We learned more about America inside the camp than we ever did outside of it." The guards, the books, the textbooks, they spoke louder than any propaganda. Despite this relative comfort, the barbed wire still mattered. It reminded every man that he was a prisoner. Guards patrolled the perimeters with rifles slung over their shoulders. They rarely fired them. Most prisoners accepted captivity peacefully. But the weapons remained visible, symbols of a war not yet finished. Still, tensions flared at times, not between Germans and Americans, but between Germans themselves. Within the compounds, factions formed. Nazi loyalists sought to enforce ideological purity, threatening or attacking fellow prisoners who expressed doubt about the Reich. Some wore their allegiance openly, organizing lectures, reading banned speeches, and attempting to maintain the spirit of Hitler's Germany within the camp. These men didn't care about ice cream or wages. They cared about loyalty. Prisoners suspected of being anti-Nazi, or merely indifferent, sometimes found themselves targeted. American authorities soon realized the danger. In several camps, they segregated hardcore loyalists to maintain order. Otherwise, the ideological battles of Europe threatened to erupt behind American fences. Still, most POWs simply wanted to survive, eat well, and go home. They formed orchestras with handmade instruments, sewing strings, and carving wood. They staged plays, performing German comedies and tragedies before cheering audiences. Some even held art exhibitions, painting the rural landscapes of America from behind the wire. These activities served a deeper purpose. They reminded men of their identity beyond war. Yet the greatest shock came during holidays. On Christmas, American commanders allowed prisoners to decorate their barracks. They received special meals, turkey, potatoes, gravy, and sometimes gifts donated by local churches. Small candles flickered beside pine branches. In those brief hours, the war felt impossibly distant. A POW once described the scene. "It was the first time I felt peace. Surrounded by enemies, I felt safer than I had in my own country." While thousands of miles away, Germany burned beneath Allied bombs. Cities vanished, families starved, letters conveyed the collapse. And in the quiet heartland of America, captured soldiers ate well, slept safely, and played soccer under a warm sun. Some wondered if they had been defeated or rescued. As weeks turned into months, the German POWs settled into a strange new rhythm. One defined not by marching orders or artillery fire, but by steady meals, farm work, and long letters home. Mail was a lifeline. Every few weeks, Prisoners lined up as American clerks distributed bundles of envelopes. Some came from mothers, some from wives, some from friends at the front. There were letters soaked with tears, others brittle with fear. Many were written in cramped handwriting on cheap paper, the result of shortages back home. These letters told a story very different from the one prisoners were experiencing. Germany, they learned, was starving. Cities lay in ruin: Hamburg, Cologne, Berlin. Names once spoken with pride were now synonymous with burning streets and collapsed neighborhoods. Bombers raged overhead, night after night. Food lines stretched for blocks. Families rationed bread with desperate precision. For some, dinner was thin soup and a memory. Fathers read their wives' words in stunned silence. They imagined children going to bed hungry while they themselves ate well behind American fences. It was a painful paradox. Many POWs concealed the truth, believing it would seem shameful to admit they were safe, even comfortable, while their families suffered. Others told everything. Their letters described the shock of American abundance. We eat meat every day. We have vegetables, coffee, butter, even ice cream. Yes, truly. Families back home could scarcely comprehend it. American propaganda, they'd been told, was a deception. But this was not propaganda. These were the words of husbands and sons. One prisoner wrote, "Mother, I have gained weight. I am ashamed to say this when I hear you have so little. Forgive me." It became clear that something was broken, not just in Germany's cities, but in the ideology that had carried the nation to war. If their enemies could feed them better than their own government, perhaps everything they'd been told had been a lie. Not all admitted the thought aloud, but silence could not extinguish doubt. Growing affection. A quiet bond between captor and captive. Surprisingly, many prisoners grew fond of their American guards. Interactions were often informal, even friendly. Some guards practiced their German. Others exchanged cigarettes or stories of home. The young men on both sides discovered how much they shared. Similar ages, similar dreams, similar fears. A guard at Camp McCoy later recalled, "They were no different from us. Same jokes, same worry about their families. Just wearing a different uniform, some POWs described American guards as relaxed and approachable. Few barked orders. Few treated prisoners with cruelty. Many were older reservists assigned to domestic service rather than combat. They viewed the Germans not as monsters, but as unlucky kids caught in a storm." Occasionally, the line blurred further. On farms, German workers sometimes joined family dinners, eating at the table beside their employers. Children asked them to read stories. Dogs jumped into their laps. Thanksgiving dinners were shared. Birthdays celebrated. For both sides, it was unsettling and profoundly human. This dynamic alarmed Nazi hardliners inside the camps. How could these men break bread with the enemy? How could they speak kindly of America? For them, captivity was a battlefield of ideology. Every gesture of American generosity was, in their eyes, a threat, a poison meant to weaken German resolve. They warned others that friendliness was a trap. Yet their warnings never fully succeeded. Food has a way of changing minds. For a soldier who had starved in the desert, a warm slice of pie on a Midwestern farm carried more weight than any speech from Berlin. The psychological shift, realizing who held the future. American abundance revealed a deeper truth. This wasn't just a rich nation. It was a nation untouched, unscarred by war. While German industry struggled to supply ammunition, the U.S. produced tanks, planes and ships in numbers previously unimaginable. POWs could see this reality in the world around them, in the factories, the railways, the endless fields of grain. Even as prisoners, they lived inside the greatest industrial engine on Earth. One POW wrote, "We fought with muscle. America fights with metal." The contrast was overwhelming. Back home, women melted church bells to make ammunition. In America, factories made airplanes faster than Germany could repair them. The realization dawned slowly, but relentlessly. Germany could not win. The war was over, long before the guns fell silent. This understanding did not always bring relief. For some, it brought despair. They had sacrificed everything: friends, youth, dreams, for a cause that could never succeed. Others felt grateful. If defeat was inevitable, perhaps captivity in America was a strange form of salvation. A safe world amid a burning one. The POW camps became quiet sanctuaries. A soldier could spend a morning working, an afternoon reading, an evening playing chess. He slept on a mattress, not in a trench. He ate until full. He wrote to his family without fearing bombs. Outside the wire, his homeland fell apart. Inside, the war faded into memory. Sometimes, at night, the prisoners gathered around mess hall radios. They listened to broadcasts of Allied victories: Normandy, the Balkans, the Philippines. The room would fall silent. Some stared at the floor. Others listened with numb acceptance. The maps in their minds shifted as each new battle made return and redemption feel ever more distant. And yet, as the news grew worse, the meals remained warm. This contrast, comfort in captivity, hunger in freedom, reshaped the minds of thousands of German soldiers. The world was no longer divided between German good and American evil. Reality was more complex and more disturbing. Many came to understand that the war was not simply lost on the battlefield. It was lost at the dinner table. A nation that could not feed its people could not sustain a global fight. Behind the barbed wire of America, the truth was impossible to ignore. By early 1945, the rumors filtering through the camp fence had become undeniable. Germany was collapsing. Hitler's pleas for last-stand resistance sounded increasingly desperate. The once proud Wehrmacht was now a shell, retreating on every front. Cities lay blackened, charred into the rubble of a dream that had died years before. Entire divisions surrendered rather than be annihilated. The Reich that promised a 1,000-year empire was visibly disintegrating before the eyes of the very men who had sworn to defend it. Inside America's camps, the prisoners sensed the end. It came not with gunfire, but with silence. May 1945. News of defeat. On May 8, 1945, guards assembled the prisoners for an announcement. Germany had surrendered. The war in Europe was over. Some prisoners of war wept openly. Some stood rigid, struggling to process the collapse of everything that had defined them. Many simply stared at the ground, numb. One prisoner recalled, "For years we fought for Germany." And in a single sentence, it was gone. The atmosphere within the camps shifted, but not toward celebration. Instead, uncertainty, fear, strange relief. Their homeland had lost, yet their families were finally safe from war. After the announcement, the mess hall served a hearty meal. Prisoners ate in silence. Forks scraped against plates. Men who had feasted on American generosity for months could not ignore the truth that they had been safer, healthier, and better fed as captives than their own families were as civilians. That realization struck deeper than any battlefield defeat. The long wait to go home. The end of the war did not mean immediate release. The United States still needed labor, especially for farms and construction. And many German prisoners continued to work for more than a year after Germany's surrender. This delay surprised some, angered others, and terrified many. What would they return to? A broken nation? A bombed-out home? Nothing. Letters brought mixed news. Some families had survived. Others had lost everything. Houses reduced to ash, cities leveled, fathers and sons buried beneath rubble. The war had ended, but the suffering had not. In the camp, prisoners continued eating regular meals: meat, vegetables, bread, butter. The contrast with Germany, where famine loomed, grew more painful with every letter. Saying goodbye to America. As transportation became available, POWs were shipped to Europe, but not always to Germany. Many were sent first to Great Britain or France to help rebuild devastated cities. The journey back was slow, measured in months rather than weeks. Before departure, some prisoners were given a final wage payment, along with basic supplies. Others received small parting gifts from American farmers: gloves, shirts, sometimes even photographs taken together on the farmstead porch. Goodbyes were emotional, even strange. American guards who had spent years watching over their prisoners shook hands and wished them luck. Farmers embraced the men who had helped bring in their harvests. Children cried, not understanding why their German playmates had to leave. One prisoner of war later wrote, "We arrived as enemies and left as friends." I could not understand it then. I still struggle to understand it now. The buses drove away, the fences disappeared behind them, and America, the land they had once been taught to hate, faded beyond the horizon. Homecoming, a nation in ruins. Nothing could have prepared them for the Germany they returned to. Railroad stations were shattered hulks. City blocks that once bustled with shops now lay barren, twisted, blackened. Children with hollow eyes wandered streets of rubble. Women scavenged among ruins for firewood. Food remained scarce. Family reunions were often bittersweet. Fathers returned to wives they scarcely recognized, thinner, older. Children shied away from men who were strangers in their own homes. Some former prisoners hid their time in America, fearing accusations of weakness or betrayal. Others spoke openly, telling stories of American farms and abundant meals. But even simple truths stirred resentment. "You were well fed while we starved." The emotional wound ran deep. Most POWs did not boast. Many avoided discussing it altogether. Yet the memories lingered. Seeds of change. A new perspective. In the years that followed, countless former prisoners reflected on their experiences. They remembered ice cream and fresh bread, laughter with farmers' children, libraries where they learned English, classrooms where they studied history, mathematics, or physics. But above all, they remembered how the Americans treated them. Not as animals, not as slaves, but as men. These memories carried influence. Many former POWs became educators, engineers, or public servants. Some traveled back to America, drawn by opportunity or nostalgia. Others helped rebuild Germany with a quiet conviction that the future must be different, built not on hatred or conquest, but on cooperation. One former POW later said, "America defeated us with food. We surrendered to a full plate." It was not a literal surrender, but a psychological one. A realization that military power alone could not sustain a nation. That humanity mattered, and prosperity mattered. The United States had shown its enemy what a functioning society looked like. Some Germans carried that lesson forward. Others spent lifetimes wrestling with it. The legacy of captivity. For decades, the story of German POWs in America remained a quiet chapter of history, overshadowed by battles and destruction. But for the men who lived it, the experience defined their understanding of the world. They arrived expecting cruelty. They found dignity. They expected hunger. They found nourishment. They expected hatred. They found humanity. In those contradictions, their worldview began to shift. Many returned home believing that Germany's future lay not in the path it had followed, but in the ideals embodied by the nation that had defeated it. The irony was profound. Behind barbed wire, they had discovered freedom of thought. As prisoners, they had learned how a society should feed, educate, and respect its people. From across the ocean, America had shown them what was possible. And in time, that quiet influence helped shape a new Germany, one that would rise from the ashes not with rage, but with resolve. Long after the camps were dismantled and the war faded into textbooks, the memories remained, vivid, sensory, and often bittersweet. For the German prisoners who had lived behind American barbed wire, those years of captivity became a defining chapter of life. They remembered not the fences or guard towers, but the smell of hot bread in the morning, the hum of tractors in distant fields, the joy of ice cream on a warm day, and the sense, shared in hushed tones, that they were safer with the enemy than with their own government. It was an extraordinary contradiction. They had arrived believing they were marching into darkness. They had been told their captors were brutal, corrupt, and weak, a nation too indulgent to fight, too disorganized to stand against Germany. But when they set foot in America, the illusion crumbled. The truth greeted them not with violence, but with hospitality. Over time, many came to understand that Germany had not just lost on the battlefield. It had lost the deeper war. The war of ideas, production, and humanity. The great American machine. The most unforgettable lesson for those POWs was the sheer scale of American capacity. Factories the size of towns, fields that stretched to infinity, stores stocked with food in the midst of global conflict. In North Africa, German soldiers had hoarded water and scraped the bottoms of ration tins. Their tanks broke down for lack of spare parts. Fuel shortages turned military operations into chaos. War became improvisation. In America, even a prisoner could see how different things were. Food arrived in abundance, as if the nation could feed the entire world. Machines were everywhere: trucks, tractors, combines, harvesters, humming day and night. It became obvious that Germany, despite its bravado, had never truly been prepared for a long war against an industrial giant. One German officer later wrote, "We fought men. America fought with factories." This realization shattered the myth of German invincibility. The same men who once toasted victory now doubted that victory had ever been possible. The quiet power of fairness. America's treatment of German POWs was not motivated by sentimentality. It was rooted in law, the Geneva Convention, and in the nation's desire to show moral authority. The U.S. understood that brutality might inspire retaliation against Allied POWs in Europe. But more fundamentally, Americans followed a cultural instinct that even an enemy deserved dignity. This instinct yielded profound results. The simple act of feeding an enemy well, of providing meat, vegetables, desserts, unwittingly became a tool of psychological warfare. Not through intimidation, but through contrast. American generosity raised a mirror to German failure. Back home, civilians starved. Soldiers at the front stole food from villagers to survive. Families prayed for a single loaf of bread. And yet, halfway across the world, their captured sons were gaining weight. This knowledge cracked the ideological shell many prisoners of war carried to America. If the enemy could treat them with fairness, if the enemy could feed them better than their own country, then perhaps the enemy was not the monster they had been told to hate. The war had said Americans were weak. The camp said otherwise. Strength, the POWs learned, was not measured only in tanks or guns, but in the ability to uphold humane principles, even in the midst of total war. Stories that crossed oceans. In the decades after the war, many former POWs returned to America, not as enemies, but as immigrants, workers, and even citizens. Some revisited the farms where they once labored. Old men, once prisoners, embraced old farmers, once guards. Years dissolved between them. Others built careers back in Germany and carried forward a quiet message that prosperity did not come from conquest, but from cooperation. Their stories shaped children, communities, and ultimately a nation rebuilding itself. A few former POWs married American women they met after the war. Some became professors of English, their first lessons learned in wooden barracks under the prairie sun. Others entered politics, advocating for peaceful ties with the West. The personal became political. Every memory, every slice of bread shared behind barbed wire, helped stitch back together a broken world. The memory of plenty. For many former prisoners, food remained the most poignant symbol of their captivity. They remembered the first meal, the disbelief as they stared at plates piled high. They remembered the desserts, pies, puddings, cake, ice cream. They remembered holidays where enemies shared turkey and song. Decades later, old men would smile through wrinkles at the thought of their first taste of Coca-Cola, a drink so foreign and frivolous that they laughed before they swallowed. Then they drank more. These memories became markers of a strange truth, that they had lived better as prisoners than as soldiers of the Reich. More than anything, food revealed the moral balance of the war. It showed that America did not win simply because it had more tanks or ships, but because it had built a society capable of feeding its citizens, its soldiers, and even its captives. It was a victory of structure, empathy, and abundance. Reflections. The unexpected lesson. In the end, the experience of German POWs in the United States taught a lesson that no commander or politician could have planned. Sometimes, the most powerful act in war is kindness. Germany's soldiers did not leave America loyal to the United States. They left with something deeper. Perspective. They carried home the memory of a nation that treated them with fairness, even while fighting them. They compared that memory to the ruin of their hometowns, the hunger of their families, and the broken ideology that had sent them to war. And they understood. Not all changed. Some clung to bitterness or denial. But many, perhaps most, returned transformed. From their stories, a quiet truth emerged. America had fought the war with steel and fire, but it won with conscience. Feeding the enemy may not win a battle, but it can win the peace. And in the long arc of history, that may be the greater victory.